It is not a matter of believing or not believing. The signs are already in front of everyone, and almost no one recognizes them. My name is James Cruz. I spent 30 years in the cockpit as a commercial pilot, and 9 days ago I died. In the time that followed, Jesus Christ showed me specific events that must occur before the end of this age. And since I came back, the sky doesn't look the same, and neither does the earth. You need to understand this before I go any further. What I am about to tell you is not about my career or my life, but about what is coming for yours. I am not a preacher. I am not a scholar. I am just a man who has spent his life looking at the horizon trying to navigate through storms. I live outside Savannah, Georgia. I manage a small regional airfield where the moss hangs heavy on the oaks, and the air usually smells like rain and jet fuel. I am there at 6 every morning. I check the hangars, talk to the mechanics, and make sure the flight school planes are ready for the students. Before I continue, if these words mean something to you, join us by subscribing to the channel. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. It helps to know we aren't standing alone in the dark. 9 days ago, I was in Hangar 4, inspecting a pressurized fuel line on a light twin-engine plane. There was a failure in the valve, a sudden, violent burst of pressure, and a flash of fire that I didn't have time to duck away from. One moment I was holding a wrench, and the next, the world simply ceased to be. The transition was not like falling asleep. It was like waking up from a dream you didn't know you were having. In my years as a pilot, I've seen the sun rise over the Atlantic from 40,000 feet. I've seen the stars when there's no city light to dim them. I thought I knew what beauty and scale were. But when that fuel line failed, I found myself in a place where the air itself felt like a living thing. There was no smoke, no smell of burning fuel, and no ringing in my ears from the blast. There was only a silence so deep it felt like it had been waiting for me my entire life. I was standing on a surface that was as clear as glass, but as firm as a mountain. I looked down at my boots, the same work boots I'd put on that morning, and I could see the grain of the leather with a clarity that made my old eyes feel young again. Every stitch was perfect. I looked at my hands, and for the first time in 20 years, the ache in my knuckles from old injuries was gone. I felt a lightness in my chest, a total absence of the gravity that usually pulls at a man's spirit. I wasn't afraid. That is the thing I want you to hold on to. In that place, fear doesn't have a place to land. It just doesn't exist. Then I realized I wasn't alone. I didn't hear footsteps, but I felt a presence that was more solid than the hangar I had just left. I turned around, and he was there. I have spent my life looking at instrument panels and navigation charts, relying on my eyes to keep people safe. But looking at him was different. It wasn't just my eyes seeing him, it was my whole life recognizing him. He was tall, but not in a way that felt small-making. He was dressed simply, but he carried himself with an authority that made the kings of the earth look like children playing in the dirt. His eyes were the most incredible part. They were a color I can't name, and when he looked at me, he didn't just see James Cruz, the retired pilot. He saw everything. He saw the time I lied to my father when I was 10. He saw the time I pulled that Cessna out of a tailspin over the Smokies and whispered a prayer I'd forgotten by the time I landed. He saw the moments I was proud and the moments I was ashamed. And the look he gave me wasn't one of anger, it was one of total, overwhelming recognition. He knew me better than I knew myself, and he loved me anyway. "James," he said. His voice was like the sound of a deep river, steady, powerful, and full of a life that never ends. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, my mouth open, feeling like a speck of dust in the middle of a sunbeam. He reached out and touched my arm, and the warmth that flowed through me felt like every good thing I had ever experienced, all happening at once. It was the feeling of coming home after the longest flight of your life. "I have something to show you," he said. He didn't move his lips the way we do, but the words were as clear as a radio signal on a quiet night. The ground beneath us didn't move, but the scene around us changed in an instant. Suddenly, we were high above the earth. I've spent thousands of hours at altitude, looking down at the patchwork of the American landscape. I know what the cities look like at night, glowing like embers. But this was different. I wasn't just seeing the lights, I was seeing the life within them. We were looking down at the United States, and at first it looked normal. The highways were busy, the lights were on in the skyscrapers, and the suburbs were quiet. But then, as he put his hand on my shoulder, my vision changed. It was like switching on a weather radar, but instead of rain or wind, I was seeing the spiritual state of the people. What I saw first was a great creeping dryness. It started in the hearts of people in the biggest cities and moved outward like a shadow across a field. I watched a man walking down a street in a busy town. He had everything a person is told they need: a good suit, a phone in his hand, a sense of purpose. But inside his chest, where his heart should have been, there was nothing but gray dust. He was moving through his life, buying things, talking to people, but he was already dead inside. And he wasn't the only one. I saw this gray dust spreading through office buildings, through schools, and even through the pews of churches. People were saying the right words and doing the right things, but their spirits had become like wood that has sat in the sun too long, brittle, dry, and ready to snap at the slightest touch. There was no peace in their homes. I saw families sitting at dinner tables where no one spoke. They were looking at screens, their faces lit by a cold, blue light, while the people sitting right across from them were like strangers. Jesus looked down at this with a sadness that I can't describe. "They have traded the living water for a desert," he said. "They believe that if they gather enough things, they can fill the hole in their souls, but the hole is getting bigger, and the things are getting smaller." He showed me that this was the beginning of the end. When the people lose their connection to what is real, they become easy to move. They become like dry grass, just waiting for a spark. As I watched, the vision shifted. The dryness in the hearts of the people began to manifest in the world around them. I saw the great structures of our society, the banks, the government offices, the giant corporations, and they started to look like old, hollow trees. On the outside, they looked strong and imposing, but I could see that the roots were rotting. The trust that holds a country together was evaporating. I saw people going to the stores, and for the first time in their lives, the things they expected to be there weren't there. I saw a woman standing in front of a shelf, her hands trembling as she realized she couldn't buy what her children needed. It wasn't a total collapse yet, but it was a stutter. The smooth, easy life that everyone took for granted was starting to hitch and jerk like an engine running out of oil. "The shaking is beginning," Jesus told me. I looked at the maps and I saw the weather patterns changing. I saw storms that looked like they had been born of anger rather than nature. I saw parts of the country that had always been green turning brown, and parts that were dry being flooded by water that had nowhere to go. The earth itself seemed to be reacting to the darkness in the people. I saw the great supply lines, the veins and arteries of the nation begin to clog. I saw ships sitting idle in the water, their holds full of goods that no one could get to. I saw trucks parked on the sides of highways because the systems that told them where to go had stopped working. It wasn't a war with bombs and soldiers, it was a war of friction. Everything was becoming harder. Every simple task was becoming a mountain to climb. And in the middle of this, I saw the people's reactions. Instead of turning to the one who could help them, they turned on each other. I saw the lines in the stores turn into arguments, and the arguments turn into something worse. I saw neighbors who had lived next to each other for 20 years suddenly looking at each other with suspicion. The drying I had seen earlier had made them brittle. There was no grace left. There was no patience. Everyone was afraid, and because they were afraid, they were angry. "They are looking for a savior in the mirror," Jesus said, his voice heavy with grief. "And when the mirror breaks, they will look for anyone who promises to put the pieces back together." I watched as the systems tried to fix themselves. I saw leaders standing on stages, their faces tight with stress, making promises they knew they couldn't keep. They were trying to use the same old tools to fix a problem that was beyond them. They were trying to manage the wind and command the rain with nothing but words. And the more they failed, the more the people cried out for someone to just make it stop. I saw the power grids in the great cities flickering. I saw the way people reacted to the darkness when the lights didn't come back on right away. It wasn't just the loss of electricity. It was the loss of the illusion of control. Without the lights and the screens, they were forced to see the dryness in their own homes, and they couldn't stand the sight of it. They wanted the noise back. They wanted the distractions back. They wanted anything that would let them stop thinking about the void inside. As this vision of the shaking world continued, I saw the first signs of the next event. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a whisper. In the middle of the chaos, in the middle of the empty shelves and the flickering lights, a new voice began to rise. It wasn't a voice of anger, but a voice of calm, practical reason. It was a voice that said, "We can fix this. We just need everyone to cooperate. We just need to bring everything under one roof." I saw people listening to this voice with a desperate kind of hope. They didn't care about the cost. They didn't care about what they would have to give up. They just wanted the grocery stores to be full again. They just wanted the lights to stay on. They were like passengers on a plane that's losing altitude, willing to listen to anyone who says they know how to land the craft. Jesus stayed silent as he showed me this. He let me feel the weight of it. He let me see the faces of the people as they began to trade their freedom for the promise of security. I saw a man in a small town, a man who had always been independent, sitting at his kitchen table and looking at a form he had to sign. He knew in his gut that something was wrong, but he looked at his hungry kids and he picked up the pen. The young man at the fire was just the beginning. As the vision continued to unfold, Jesus showed me that the world was entering a stage where the lines between the physical and the spiritual were becoming thin. I saw that the system wasn't just about food and security. It was about the very way people understood reality. In the cities, where the golden chain was most tightly wrapped, the air felt stagnant, like a room that had been sealed off from the outside for decades. People were living in a constant state of being watched, and yet they felt more alone than ever. They were connected to a global network, but they had lost the ability to look a neighbor in the eye and see a fellow human being. Jesus led me to a high place where I could see the administrative heart of the nation. I saw office buildings filled with people who weren't necessarily evil, but who were part of a machinery that had lost its conscience. They were making decisions based on efficiency, on numbers, and on the stability of the whole. I saw how they viewed the unlabeled, the people like us who had refused the scan. They didn't see families, they saw obstacles. They didn't see believers, they saw risks. When people stop seeing the image of God in one another, Jesus said, they will eventually see only a problem to be solved. The fourth event came last, and I believe this timing was critical, because without everything that preceded it, it would look like one more disaster instead of what it actually is. What I watched was not a sudden eruption of violence against believers. There were no soldiers breaking down church doors, no dramatic public executions that would have made the nature of the thing obvious and the response to it simple. What I watched was quieter than that. And because it was quieter, it was, in many ways, worse. The persecution I saw arriving did not announce itself as persecution. It arrived as policy. It arrived as the reasonable administrative consequence of choices people had already made, framed in the language of public safety and community responsibility, and the practical necessity of managing a society under severe resource strain. The people who had refused the biometric system in the weeks and months prior had effectively removed themselves from the formal infrastructure of daily life. No longer able to access distribution networks, medical systems, or institutional protections, they existed in a parallel reality that the larger culture increasingly had no framework for understanding. And what people cannot understand, they eventually stop tolerating. I watched how the language shifted. First, communities of refusal were not initially described as threats. They were described as liabilities, as drains on systems that were already strained beyond their designed capacity. The argument was not that these people were dangerous, but that their choices imposed costs on everyone else, and in a moment of collective scarcity, that argument found willing ears. I watched it move through local governments, through school board meetings, through neighborhood associations that had once been civil and had become something tightly wound and suspicious. I watched the consensus form, the way ice forms on still water, gradually and then all at once. I watched the communities of the faithful become invisible to the surrounding culture. And I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because invisible is not quite the same as hidden. They were not hiding. They were present. They were serving one another, extending care outward to anyone who came near them, regardless of what those people had chosen or believed. But the world around them had organized itself around a system those communities had refused. And that refusal had placed them outside the categories the larger culture used to see and account for people. They had become, in the administrative and social imagination of the nation I was watching, simply absent. Not dangerous, not martyred, just no longer legible. The remnant was smaller than I expected. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. I had assumptions formed over years of flying across this country, looking down at the steeples in every town about the scale of genuine belief in this land. What I saw from that suspended vantage was a correction to those assumptions that I found painful in a way I am still carrying. The communities of genuine faithfulness were scattered. They were not always in the places I would have predicted. They were not organized around the institutions I would have identified as strong. What marked them was not the precision of their doctrine, though many of them held doctrine carefully. What marked them was a quality of love that remained functional under pressure, that did not collapse into self-protection when the costs of extending it became real. I watched people in those communities make choices that cost them repeatedly and continue making them, and I understood that this was what Jesus had been watching in them for years before I ever saw them. He spoke near the end of this vision, and his voice carried the grief I had heard before, but also something else underneath it, something resolute and fierce in a way that was not anger but was not far from it. He said that the remnant emerging from this sequence of pressures was the church that would enter what was coming, not the church that had memorized the correct positions, not the church that had prepared the most comprehensive survival infrastructure. The church that had loved genuinely when loving genuinely was the most expensive thing available to them. Each one is a gate, he said, and each gate is harder to pass through rightly than the one before it. And the people who pass through all four with their love intact and their faith pointed outward rather than inward are the people for whom what is coming has already been prepared. I watched a woman in one of those communities pray over a man who had accepted the system, who had taken what she had refused, who had come to her because he had nowhere else to go. She simply opened what she had and gave it. "These are mine," he said. And I understood he was not speaking only of her. Jesus then showed me a vision of those who had refused, but for the wrong reasons. I saw people who had built fortresses. They had food, they had weapons, and they had the right answers. But their hearts had become hard. They were resisting the system, but they were doing it out of pride and a desire to survive alone. They had closed their doors to the suffering neighbor just as tightly as the system had closed its doors to them. Jesus looked at them with a profound grief. He showed me that being right about the signs is not enough if you lose your humanity in the process. He showed me that a heart that becomes a bunker is just as dark as a heart that takes the scan. "Do not let the fear of what is coming turn you into a stone," he whispered to me. "The only thing you can take with you when you leave the earth is the love you gave away." The vision began to fade then. The bright, high view of the country started to pull back, and the sounds of the hangar, the distant hiss of the fuel lines, the clank of metal, began to echo in the corners of my mind. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay in that place where the air was life and where the truth was as solid as a rock. I reached out for him, but he just smiled and placed his hand on my chest. "Go back, James," he said. "The window is still open, but the sun is setting. Tell them what you saw. Tell them that I am not looking for those who can survive the storm, but for those who will walk through it with their hands held out to others." I was still in that place, still beside him, when I felt the weight of my body beginning to reassert itself, heavy and confining, and suddenly very present. And then the electricity came and I was back. The defibrillator brought me back the way a car crash brings you awake. Not gradually, not gently, but with a violence that felt like being locked back into my body from the outside. The first sensation was fire in my chest. Not pain in the ordinary sense, but something closer to a demand, a physical insistence that I occupy space again, that I breathe, that I be present in a world I had just been lifted entirely out of. I heard voices before I could see faces, professional voices, controlled, calling numbers and instructions back and forth across me, the way people do when they have done a thing many times, and efficiency is how they show they care. The paramedic closest to me had his hand on my shoulder and was saying my name in that particular careful tone that means they are checking whether what is in front of them is fully a person again. I could not explain to him what I had just been shown. I could not explain to any of them. They were doing their jobs with a precision and a competence that I respected, moving around me with the practiced calm of people who understood exactly what had happened to my body and exactly what needed to happen next. They had no way of knowing that the man on the floor was not the same man who had gone down. The visions did not fade. That was the first thing I understood clearly, lying there on the ground with an oxygen mask being fitted over my face. Every detail was present with the same weight and clarity it had carried in that place. The sequence of events, the things I had watched unfold above the country, the specific texture of what each one meant and what followed from it, none of it was softening at the edges. None of it was acquiring the quality that memories acquire when they begin to drift. I have been a pilot for 30 years. I know the difference between a dream and a clear horizon. I know the difference between something your mind manufactures under stress and something that was placed in you with a specific intention that you would carry it. These were placed. I knew that lying on the floor of that hangar, and I know it now, I was in the hospital for 2 days. The doctors used words like event and episode, and they spoke about my heart with a technical precision that I found oddly comforting, because it meant they were focused on the physical facts, and the physical facts were manageable. What they could not account for was the thing I brought back with me. I did not tell them. I am not certain they would have used the same technical precision for that conversation. I lay in that bed and I went over each vision methodically, checking my recollection against itself for consistency. It was consistent every time. The spiritual drying, the systemic shaking, the golden chain of security, and the quiet narrowing of the faithful remnant. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to a person who has been shown true things. I want to be honest about that, because I think dishonesty about the cost of this is its own kind of failure. The loneliness is not bitterness. It is not doubt. It is the specific weight of carrying something real that most people around you will not accept as real until the moment for acceptance has passed, and all that remains is grief. I was told to speak anyway, not to persuade, not to position myself to say I told you so when the events arrive, but to be faithful to what I was given and to trust that the people who need to hear this will hear it in time to do something with it. I served my profession for 30 years. I am telling you what I saw because I was told to tell you. I am telling you because the window for the choices that matter is open right now in these weeks and months before the sequence completes. And a person who knew the window was open and said nothing would have to answer for that silence. The events I saw are not abstractions. They are not theological categories for discussion. They are coming in the order I have described, and each one narrows what is possible after it. And the people who are prepared when the last of them arrives are the people who made decisions while those decisions were still available to make. I'm not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to hold still long enough to consider what it would mean if what I have told you is exactly as true as I know it to be. The window is open now. The sequence has been given, and what you do with what you've heard is between you and God. I am not asking you to take my word for it, but to look out at the world with new eyes. The signs are already all around us, ready to be recognized by those who do not fear the truth. I have shared this vision not to unsettle you, but because the window for choosing is still open, and the time to build real foundations is now before the silence becomes final. If you feel this message has reached you for a reason, I ask you not to let it end here. Share it with those you love and leave your thoughts in the comments. Because in this time of fracture, Our strength will be our ability to recognize one another. Subscribe to stay close on this journey of awareness. Remember, it is not about how much we have gathered to survive, but how much love we are capable of offering when the world stops working. Stand firm, stay human. God bless you.